Hello, welcome to That's Runnable. I'm Tommy. I'm an ultra runner and general adventure and outdoors enthusiast. This show that you're settling into is built on the mantra Run the Runnable. Our focus here is on doing what you can, focusing on what you can achieve, what we can control, and doing it no matter what. We're not here to soften the demands of your running goals. I'm not here just to tell you that you're fine to take a day off and it's okay to feel negative about your running and all of that. But I am here to tell you that that's part of the journey we're on, and that's okay. Our goal is to help each runner overcome our mental battles, to be kind and encouraging about the path we're on, and to celebrate the fact that we're out here running the runnable, doing what we can to work on ourselves, showing up for us so that we can show up for the people around us, and praise self-improvement, growth, hard work, and enjoying the process. Before we dive into today's topic on the importance of high volume, I have a couple of things to say. In July next year, I'll be attempting my first 100 miler. Last year, I had a place at UTMB, but got injured and the dream of running 100 miles was brutally delayed. So this year, I've been on the lookout for a race that excites me and perhaps is the antithesis of the difficult to get into UTMB. Devil's Gulch is based out in Washington State. It's run by Evergreen Trails, and I was introduced to them by my friend Josh over at Borderlands, and they kindly invited me to participate. We've set up a 10% discount for you with the code Tommy, and anyone from the That's Runnable fam who does join will be doing a bit of an evening before get together where we can all share our excitement before the race and maybe clink a pre-race beer together. So there's more information on that race. There's a link to it in the show notes. If you want to watch an amazing documentary, a race documentary put together by Borderlands from last year's Devil's Gulch, I've linked that in the show notes too. And I do want to shout out what Josh is doing over at Borderlands. He's got what's fast become my favourite ultra running podcast. He's not asked me to say this and doesn't know I am, but Josh has been a great support to me. I've had a few chats with him on the podcast and I'm proud to now call him a friend. Although we've never met, we share a similar ethos, and I think he's really capturing and encapsulating everything I love about ultra running in the work he's doing. So do go and check out his podcast and follow his Instagram. I think it's really good stuff and I rarely miss an episode he puts out at the moment. So yeah, there's just a public thank you to Josh and a recommendation for you if you wanted a fresh take and something that dives in on the culture I love about this sport. Okay, enough preamble. As always, we have some listener questions at the end, so stick around for that. But let's get into it and talk about the importance of high volume in your training. High volume training is one of the most fundamental concepts in running, and it's often overshadowed, I think, by kind of flashy speed sessions or high intensity intervals, all the stuff that is nice for an Instagram reel. But here's the secret. Most great endurance athletes build their fitness on a solid foundation of miles and lots of them, or maybe kilometers, wherever you're coming in from. In this episode, we'll dive into what high volume training means, why it's critical for endurance improvement, and how you can incorporate it into your routine safely. So whether you're aiming for your first marathon or an ultramarathon, or simply becoming a more resilient runner, embracing high mileage can unlock new levels of performance and satisfaction. So I want to first start by talking about what high volume really means. We'll then go into the science behind high volume, the benefits of high volume training, how to implement high volume safely, some common pitfalls to avoid, and then we'll talk about some sort of case studies. I'll share a personal story, and then we'll think about adapting high volume to your goals specifically. So, what does high volume really mean? Training volume refers to the total time or distance you spend training in a given period. We usually measure it on a weekly basis. Some people measure it on a monthly basis. I tend to look at my weekly volume so it's easily adapted and I don't try and meet monthly volume targets. But what counts as high will vary depending on your current fitness level, experience, and goals, of course. For a beginner, running sort of 30 to 40 kilometers per week might feel like really high volume, whereas some elite marathon runners or ultra marathon runners can log up to 160 kilometers a week, so 100-mile weeks or more. Mad, right? So there's a couple of key points that I want you to consider. I've got 3 here, so a few key points. A couple would be 2, wouldn't it? So the first is relative to your base. High volume should push you, it should push your current boundaries without completely overloading your body. So we need to strike a good balance. High volume is something that is massively beneficial, but the value comes when we accumulate that volume over time, week on week. And so it's important that we make sure we're pushing the current boundaries, but we're not overloading the body. The second point to consider is gradual progression. Gradual progression. It's not about jumping into high mileage overnight. It's tempting sometimes when you see other people racking up mad volume to think, oh, that's where I need to be. And so you jump up to that volume as quickly as you possibly can. But it's not about getting up there as soon as you possibly can. It's about building it sustainably over weeks, months, and even years. And the third point to consider is adaptation over time. Adaptation over time. As your fitness does improve, what was once high volume might become your new normal. As you adapt over time, as your body gets used to this high volume, the experience of that high volume is going to be slightly different. So you've got to give it time. Make sure you're progressing gradually and you're giving your body time to adapt. So those are just 3 key points that I want you to consider about what high volume is relative to your base, gradual progression, and adaptation over time. I also want to start this conversation by sort of prefacing it with easy training. Whilst volume specifically refers to the amount of training you're doing, the time or distance measured, I want to stress the importance of intensity of this volume. Most of your running should be done at a low intensity. Obviously, volume, just the term volume, doesn't consider that intensity, but I want to make sure we're prefacing this whole conversation by considering the intensity of that volume. It's not sustainable to be doing loads of high intensity volume. We'll come on to this later in the episode, but I did want to start things off by saying that that most of what we're talking about today is referring to easy volume, and the simple importance of volume alone is really what we're discussing today. You'll only be able to get to high volume in a safe and sustainable way if you're training easy most of the time. So that's a little bit of an introduction on what high volume really means. So next I want to talk about the science behind high volume. The science behind high volume. Why is high volume so effective? Well, it fundamentally changes how your body functions during endurance efforts. So we've got 3 points here: aerobic capacity, fat utilization, and resilience and recovery. So aerobic capacity. I've spoken about this before on a previous episode, and we could even probably dedicate an entire episode to it. It would probably get scientific above my head. I might have to bring someone on. But running long and often improves your body's ability to deliver oxygen to muscles. It improves your body's ability to deliver oxygen to muscles, and it enhances mitochondrial density. That's the energy factories in cells, and capillary growth. And this all allows for better blood flow to working muscles. So your aerobic capacity is sort of like, I like to think of it sort of like an engine. We're building a bigger engine. We're making an efficient, more economical engine, something that can last for longer and operate efficiently. So it's all about your body's ability to deliver oxygen, to utilize oxygen efficiently and deliver oxygen to the muscles in the best way possible. So that's aerobic capacity. So high volume will build that aerobic capacity. It will increase the size of your engine. We want a V8 and not a two-stroke for any of the petrol heads out there. The second point is fat utilization. This is something I, in honesty, get a little bit scared about talking about because people sometimes can get it confused. We're not talking about running easy being better for losing fat and losing weight. We're talking about energy and what sort of energy your body is using. So the body has two primary fuel sources for running: carbohydrates or glycogen and fats. So carbohydrates, glycogen, is stored in the muscles and the liver, and it's the body's kind of go-to energy source for moderate to high intensity efforts. So that's the energy source that your body's using when you're going out there and racing. However, these glycogen stores are limited. So most runners can only really carry about 90 minutes to 2 hours. Some elites can do more of glycogen at race pace. So you really have a limited amount you can use this carbohydrate source of fuel. Whereas fats, the other primary fuel source, is nearly unlimited in its energy source. Not quite, but it is a much longer lasting energy source. But it's slower to convert into usable energy. Fat utilization requires a well-developed aerobic system, which is built through consistent high-volume training. It's built through consistent high-volume training. So long, slow runs teach your body to burn fat more efficiently. Sparing glycogen stores for later stages in your run or in your race, whatever situation you're in. And so this is crucial for distance events like marathons or ultras, which many of you who will be listening to this are well into. One of the most critical adaptations from high volume training is improving your body's ability to use fat as a primary fuel source during exercise. This adaptation is especially important for endurance athletes, obviously, and it enables you to essentially just go further and feel stronger during long distance efforts. So really what we're trying to do with this high volume, easy training is teach the body to use a more efficient, the better fuel source to make sure that we're not depleting so quickly on race day. There is utility in both primary fuel sources, but a lot of people don't have that big engine, they don't have the aerobic capacity, and they haven't taught their body to utilize fat for fuel. In practical terms, what this is doing is it's teaching your body to operate efficiently at an easy pace. So once you've been doing it for a very long period of time, you'll be able to run easy and your muscles aren't gonna fatigue as quickly because your body is using the right source of fuel. So you'll be able to operate for a very long period of time when you've built that bigger engine and you've taught your body what fuel source to be using. And that happens when you're training high volume, you're consistently training high volume and easy. Now, the third point here is resilience and recovery. Consistent high volume training strengthens the connective tissues, the bones, the muscles, and really reduces the risk of injury. And it also enhances your recovery by improving blood flow and waste clearance from the muscles. I always like to think of this with an analogy to the gym. For anyone who is an avid gym goer, you will know that it would be ludicrous to go in every time and try and do a 1 rep max, or it would be stupid to be intense every time with every set that you're doing. To really build strength and resilience in your muscles and your bones and connective tissues, you want to be doing high volume of easier reps and occasionally really pushing for those higher weighted, fewer reps sets. Does that make sense? So if I'm going to go and try and improve my bench press, I'm going to be doing a lot of lower weighted bench presses, but increase the number of reps I'm doing. And then every now and then I'll go in and try and do a 1 rep max, or maybe 3 reps of a set at a really high weight. It's the same in running. We don't want to be just going out there and putting everything out there on the pavements every time we go out for a run. We want to be doing low intensity, low demand on the muscles, but a lot more volume. That will build resilience, and it will improve the body's ability to recover, because it improves the blood flow and waste clearance from the muscles. So that's the science behind high volume, aerobic capacity building, fat utilization, and resilience and recovery. Now I want to talk about the benefits of high volume training. And we've got 4 points here: improved endurance, efficient recovery, consistency over intensity, and mental toughness. So improved endurance. As we've just discussed, high volume creates a bigger aerobic engine, and this essentially enables you to sustain effort over a long period of time, over long distances. So whether you're chasing a personal best or you're going for a huge ultra challenge, this endurance is so fundamental. It's such a key part of what it takes to be an ultra runner or be a distance runner of any kind. No matter the level you're at, that's going to look very different for you. You know, endurance for you might be 5 kilometers. Endurance for someone else might be 100 kilometers. But high volume, no matter what you're training for, relative to you and your ability and your goals, is essential for building that endurance, for building a bigger aerobic engine. So it's going to improve endurance. It's also going to make for more efficient recovery. The more you do run, the more efficient your body becomes at clearing lactate and recovering after hard sessions. This means you can essentially train more frequently without feeling so much fatigue. So this high volume you're putting into your training is improving your ability to recover, because your body becomes more efficient at clearing lactate. So I don't know if you've ever done a really intense workout and you can feel that lactate in your muscles. What we're talking about here is the body's ability to clear lactate and recover with good blood flow after hard sessions. And what that's going to do for you is mean you can get back out there and train again more frequently, because recovery gets quicker. So higher volume improves your recovery. Thirdly, consistency over intensity. There's a lot of research out there that shows that most runners benefit from more consistent, moderate training than just sporadic bursts of high intensity work. High volume, with the majority of your miles at an easy pace, is the ultimate consistency builder. Making sure you're consistent in your training is such a fundamental part of your success with your running goals. And if you're just going out and being intense with your training all the time, and you might not even realize it, you might just be going out and working at what feels like a moderate pace, but it is a little bit too intense, you're gonna sacrifice your ability to be consistent. So making sure you're easing up and you're going at an easy pace and really decreasing your speed will make sure you'll be able to show up more consistently. So you really need to prioritize consistency over intensity, because in the long run, you'll be able to accumulate more volume. You'll be able to increase your volume. And that's what we're talking about here, the benefits of high volume. And that only happens when you show up frequently and consistently over a long period of time. So we've spoken about improved endurance, efficient recovery, and consistency over intensity. And finally, I just want to say mental toughness is another key benefit of high volume training. When you spend hours and hours and hours on your feet, it teaches you patience, resilience, and grit. And these mental gains really do translate directly to race day when the going gets tough. Just today, I went out on a 2-hour run. Maybe not that long for some, maybe really long for others. For me, I've just been starting to build my volume back up, and it's been a few weeks since I've been out for 2 hours. And I got to an hour and a half in, And it required grit to keep to the promise I'd made to myself to run for 2 hours. And that mental toughness, that mental resilience is so valuable and translates into race day. When it comes to a point where I need to lock in and keep going no matter what, I need to have practiced that. In my training, I need to know what it feels like to be out there for a long period of time. Especially as someone who's training for ultramarathons, I need to practice being out there for a long period of time and spending a lot of time on my feet. That mental side of things is really such an important part of our training. And it's not just the physical benefits that we gain from high volume, it's also psychological. There's huge benefit in going out for a long period of time as it relates to mental toughness and grit and resilience. And maybe we don't talk about that enough. So there's some benefits of high volume training: improved endurance, efficient recovery, consistency over intensity, and mental toughness. So now I want to talk about how to implement high volume safely. How to implement high volume safely. High volume is not just about running yourself into the ground. It's really important that we approach this wisely and that we do it in a way that's sustainable. So I've got sort of 4 sub-points here. The first is follow the 80-20 rule. I don't know if there's any science behind the 80-20 rule in this instance, to be honest, but it is something that's easy to remember and seems to work very well for a lot of people. So this is that you're keeping 80% of your runs at an easy conversational pace and 20% at moderate or hard efforts. So these easy miles should feel relaxed. This is where the volume builds without overwhelming your body. And then the 20% can be kept for the quality sessions, the intervals, the tempos, thresholds, hill sprints, all that good stuff. So how that translates is, let's say you're doing 5 runs a week. 4 of them can be easy training, and then 1 of them can be some sort of quality workout. But I want to also sort of caution you in saying that your volume is different from the number of runs you're doing, of course, and this 80-20 rule is just a bit of a guide, and really in reality there's a lot of good benefits to, at least at the start, building a foundation, building a base, actually having 90% of your training being easy, or at least for a few weeks even just having all of your training really easy before you start implementing any high intensity training. But it is obviously important to recognize that that can get quite boring. So if you want to throw in some intensity in the middle of your long run, for example, that's also a good way to do it. But making sure that at least 80% of your training, for the most part, is nice and easy. So follow the 80-20 rule. Secondly, prioritize recovery. Sleep, nutrition, hydration, all absolutely crucial for managing the demands of higher mileage. Don't be afraid to take rest days or include active recovery like cross-training, maybe cycling or yoga or walking. Recovery is such a key part to this. You will be demanding a lot of your body as you increase your volume. And so don't be fooled by the fact that it's easy. You are demanding a lot from your body, and it's important to absolutely prioritize recovery. Your best tool for recovery is sleep. Getting your sleep routine down, locking it in as well as you possibly can, is really the silver bullet of recovery. So make sure you get your sleep down, make sure your nutrition is solid, locked in. You can obviously do more on nutrition, often a contentious subject. Everyone has different diets, but making sure you have a high protein diet, it's whole foods, it's good quality food, and making sure you have a good variety of food in your diet. And hydration, always fueling with hydration. You don't necessarily always need to be using electrolytes, but if you have some sort of electrolytes whilst you're training, that can be helpful. All of this stuff is great for recovery, and consider recovery as a priority. So prioritize recovery. Thirdly, build gradually. This is obviously crucial. Increase your weekly mileage by a small amount each time. Too many people run into high volume way too quickly. But I would say no more than 5 to 10% each week will give your body time to adapt. And then every 3 or 4 weeks, maybe cut back your mileage for a recovery week or plateau your mileage for a few weeks. You really want to be cautious with how quickly you're increasing your mileage. The more conservative, the better. So build gradually. And as I'm always a big advocate of, supplement with strength training. If you can add 2 or 3 sessions of strength training per week, this is going to massively help you build the durability needed to handle high volumes and also avoid injury throughout the process. So really focus on lower body strength, core stability and mobility. It's such a crucial element of what it means to be a strong runner. You have to go to the gym, you have to improve your strength in the stabilizing muscles and everything you're demanding a lot of as you're running. And I often try and use my strength sessions to kind of check in, to sort of move my body in ways that I'm not tending to do even at home, to get in a full squat position, to work on my mobility and just make sure that my body is functioning in a way that it should be. So prioritize your strength training. Balancing the two can be difficult, but making sure you are doing both, you're building slowly, is going to be such an important part of building that volume. You're demanding a lot of your body when you're increasing your volume. So don't consider strength training as demanding more of it. Consider it as making sure it's bulletproof and that it can deal with that higher volume. There might be times where you sort of phase your approach to strength training and high volume, where at the start you're doing more strength training and less volume, and then you're slowly building your volume. And when you get to the peak of your training, you might not be able to do so much strength training. So you're focusing more on the volume itself, but you've got good strength built from those earlier phases. But making sure you're always thinking about partnering the two, your high volume of running or even cross training and your strength, is going to be so important to implement high volume safely. So there's some tips on how to implement high volume safely. Now I just want to talk about some common pitfalls to avoid. And I have 3 that I've written down here. The first is overtraining. Signs of overtraining can be subtle, but you really need to make sure you're tuned in to these things. It could be persistent fatigue. It might be that you're feeling fatigued for a whole week, and at that point you may consider the fact that you could be overtraining. You could be irritable. I can get very irritable sometimes, and often without someone telling me, I don't recognize it's probably because I'm overtraining. It could be poor sleep. It could be performance plateaus. But listen to your body and back off if needed. I think this is something that everyone is going to figure out for themselves. I still am figuring this out. When I increase my volume, when I increase my training intensity, I can overtrain without realizing it. It can be subtle. And many people say there's no such thing as overtraining. It's only under recovering. I don't think that's the actual phrase, but there's something to be said for that. Of course, if you're getting a lot of good recovery in, then you should be well equipped to train intensely. And if you are getting a good amount of recovery in, then it's definitely going to help to improve your ability to train, to increase your volume and increase your training. But the reality is you could be doing everything you possibly can to recover well, and you're just training too much. And that's causing you to be fatigued and irritable, and it might affect your sleep, and you might perform poorly on certain runs. But just make sure you're cognizant of whether you're overtraining. And like I said, making sure you are not rushing your progression, which we'll touch on in a second, is really important for that. So take the conservative option all the time and make sure you're not overtraining. Another common pitfall to avoid is neglecting intensity. Of course, this whole episode is about volume. The priority of that is to make sure a lot of it is easy, but it's important to also make sure you're getting occasional speed work in there. Many people will, and myself can be included in this, will just increase volume without much intensity at all. But it's really important to make sure you're throwing in strides, tempo runs, intervals, and keep your training well-rounded, and think of it as sort of sharpening your race-specific fitness. We'll talk about how we can phase your training using sort of periodization, and in the earlier stages of a phased approach, you might not have as many speed sessions in there, quality sessions in there, and later on you might throw in more. But throughout all of your training, making sure there is some more intense training in there is really important. And this is all going to benefit everything we've spoken about from a scientific standpoint, in terms of adaptation and all of that good stuff. So high volume training is important for building a big engine, but so is high intensity and making sure you're doing a lot of speed work too, when you can. So that's a common pitfall to avoid, is just completely neglecting intensity and doing none of it in this high volume effort. And then the third and final common pitfall I wanted to stress is rushing progression. If you jump from 40k to 80k in just a few weeks, like 40k per week to 80k per week in just a few weeks, this is an absolute recipe for injury, and it's just not the way to do it. I see it so much. I see people just go from 10k a week, 15k a week, to suddenly throwing down 50k weeks. This is just not sustainable, and it's not actually a productive way to train. Remember, sustainable progress always beats quick fixes. So make sure you're being patient, you're showing up consistently, and you're giving yourself time to accumulate that volume and progress slowly and carefully. So don't rush your progression. So there's just 3 common pitfalls I wanted to make sure you're avoiding: overtraining, neglecting intensity, and rushing progression. So a couple of case studies and anecdotes just to perhaps make it slightly more interesting for you. I spoke about Eliud Kipchoge last week on the previous episode, so go check that out if you haven't already. He, of course, is probably the most famous marathon runner of our generation. I say probably, definitely. And he trains with extremely high mileage. He often exceeds 180 kilometers per week. Now, this is obviously not completely realistic for most of us, but it does highlight the role of volume in building world-class endurance. All of these elite athletes out there are stacking up huge amounts of volume over long periods of time, and they're doing it in a way that is safe, ensures consistency, and builds a good foundation for the more intense work they're doing. But the consistent truth across the board for all of these elite marathon runners, and of course ultramarathon runners, is their volume is extremely high. Now, I don't want you thinking that you have to do 180 kilometers per week to run a marathon. That's absolutely not the case. But the more volume you do in a safe manner, the better equipped you're going to be to last on these marathon runs, on these longer distances that you're doing. To hammer that home, I just wanted to share a little bit of a personal story, I guess. The most valuable thing I've done for my ultra training is simply focus on volume. When I started doing ultra running, of course, my first thought was I need to increase my volume. And so I started doing that. I started to increase the amount I was running, the time I was spending out on my feet. And I didn't necessarily expect all of the benefits to come from it. I thought I was just simply preparing for longer distances. But as I did that, my fitness improved, my confidence improved, and my race day performances vastly improved as well. I go through phases. I will have a good extended period of rest for my body where my volume isn't very high, but maintaining a consistent practice and accumulating that volume has been a key part of my own personal ultra running success in reaching my goals, and it continues to be. And as I approach a 100 miler next year, my absolute priority will be to have high volume in my training. It is just such a fundamental part of performing well in distance running. And so finally, I just wanted to talk about adapting high volume to your goals. Adapting high volume to your goals. Not all runners need the same mileage, obviously. You are not Eliud Kipchoge. You don't need 180 kilometers per week. For a lot of marathon runners out there, they simply don't need to be running that sort of volume. But we all have different goals, and it's important to tailor your approach to your goals. So for marathoners, for example, I would say focus on gradually building to 60 to 100 kilometers per week, depending on the experience you have. So including long runs and marathon paced efforts in that is going to be really important. But there should be a good phase of 5 or 6 weeks before your marathon that consists of a consistent 60 to 100 kilometers per week. If you're an experienced marathon runner, I would say you would do well to get up to 100. Sometimes people will be doing 120 kilometers per week for 5 or 6 weeks as your major training block. There will be a lot of intensity in there as well. But if you can get to a point where you're accumulating that sort of volume and you're doing it in a safe way and not running into injuries, you will do extremely well in your marathon. For the maybe less experienced marathon runners, if you're training for your first marathon, make sure you're giving yourself as much time as possible in the run up to that marathon. 20 weeks is not enough time. It's not enough time to be training for a marathon if you're going from zero to a marathon. You have to be giving yourself more time. The more time you give yourself to accumulate that volume, to build slowly, the better, because the safer it's going to be, the less likely you are to run into injuries, and simply put, the more volume you'll be able to accumulate over that time. So if you're looking at running your first marathon and you've booked something in for the spring or the summer, absolutely prioritize getting your training in now. Start accumulating that volume in the right way, because once you get to that phase of training in the 8 weeks prior to your race, you can be up at decent volume at maybe 60k, 70k a week and feeling good about it. A lot of easy training that's not demanding too much of your body, that's just over that threshold to demand something of your body but in a safe way. That's going to be really crucial for ensuring you're successful in meeting that goal of running that marathon. So build slowly, give yourself as much time as possible, accumulate a huge amount of volume, as much as you possibly can. Too many runners out there, too many new runners out there will sign up to a marathon and leave it too late. They just leave it too late before starting their training. And it's just not, I just don't think it's cool. It's not a cool thing to do, to wait a long period of time before you start training. You're going to limit your potential. You're going to increase the likelihood of injury. And I don't know, it's when someone does an exam and they say they didn't really even revise for the exam. It's not really a cool thing to do. It's better to train and work hard than to not train at all. And so put the effort in now. The more admirable thing to do is to train hard, to show up, to be an example. Put the training in, start training, start putting your volume in. You will not regret it. And then for more, I guess, recreational runners, don't know how else to put that. Even modest mileage increases. If you're going from 30 kilometers to 50 kilometers weekly, this can lead to real noticeable gains in fitness and stamina. And if you're time crunched, cross training, cycling, swimming, elliptical, making sure you're walking when you can, this can all complement to your running and boost endurance without additional impact and stress. It's important to think about aerobic volume outside of your running as well. So wherever you can do easy training, in inverted commas, anyway, you can put in some volume in some way, is going to really help and improve your running ability. So don't be sedentary for the 23 hours outside of your run. Make sure you're throwing in as much volume accumulation that you can outside of running as well. This is really going to help you to get those noticeable gains in your fitness and in your stamina and in your endurance. So no matter what level you're at, getting volume in, considering volume as outside of your running as well, is going to be really helpful. So adapt your high volume to your goals. Doesn't matter if you're an ultra runner, a marathon runner, a recreational runner who's not racing. High volume is going to be really important for all of you. So make sure you're putting it in there in the best way you possibly can. So we've spoken about what high volume really means relative to your base, gradual progression, adaptation over time. We've focused on easy training, making sure that volume is predominantly easy. We've talked about the science behind high volume, aerobic capacity building, fat utilization, and resilience and recovery. The benefits of high volume training, that being improved endurance, efficient recovery, consistency over intensity, and the value of consistency, mental toughness. We've spoken about how to implement high volume safely, following the 80-20 rule, prioritizing recovery, building gradually and supplementing with strength training, the common pitfalls to avoid: overtraining, neglecting intensity, and rushing progression. A couple of case studies and anecdotes in there from the elite runners, all of them having high volume, to my own personal experience of increasing volume and seeing massive improvements because of it. And then we've spoken about adapting the high volume we're talking about to your goals specifically, no matter whether you're an ultra runner, a marathoner, a half marathoner, 10K runner, just a recreational runner who's just wanting to go out there every day. High volume is going to be really important for all of you. So if you can increase your volume, increase your volume. So to conclude, high volume training is a game changer for runners. Building the aerobic base, the resilience, mental toughness, all needed for long distance success. It's not about running fast every day. It's about showing up, running consistently, and giving your body the time it needs to adapt. So, lace up your shoes, slow down your pace, and embrace the grind of higher mileage. The journey might be long, but the rewards, both physical and mental, I promise you, are well worth it. Okay, now we're going to do some listener questions. This is my favourite part, and we've had quite a lot come in over the last week or so. I'm thinking I might do a dedicated Q&A episode every now and then just to catch up, but we're going to try and get through a few at the end here. If you have your own listener question that you want to submit, maybe it's just like a topic that you think's interesting and you want my take on, whether it's a good one or not such a good take, you might want it. You can do that. You can submit your own little voice note. There's a link in the show notes. Feel free to just do that, and we can discuss it on a future episode. Okay, so the first question is from, I forget. Who wants to go first?
Hi Tommy, it's Adam here from Ware in Hertfordshire. Just started my running journey, or my serious running journey, over the past month or so, following a bit of a training plan. I'm looking for your advice on interval training. I did my first 400 meter by 6 loop yesterday. Found it really hard. It probably didn't help that it was just around near my house and it was a bit hilly. And my plan didn't really tell me how long I should have a break for in between each loop. So I was wondering if you could provide some advice on how to do these interval training and how much rest I should have in between and how often. Maybe my plan shows once a week. Should I be doing it more often or not? Or should I be extending the distances? Yeah, looking for any advice really. But thanks again. Hope to hear from you soon.
Thanks, Adam. Great question. And I have to say, quite a difficult one to give blanket advice on, because intervals can be changed up quite a lot. There's all different types of interval sessions you can do, from the slightly longer intervals that might be more specific for marathon training to intervals that are going to be faster and quicker and shorter for maybe a 5K race. So it really does depend on what you're training for. But to try and answer your question specifically, your training plan didn't really give you any advice on what the rest time would be. I think in that instance, if there's no specified rest time, really what it's probably sort of expecting from you is to just give as much time as you need to fully recover from that interval. It's important with interval training to make sure you're not slowing down through each interval. So let's say you had 8 intervals to do. You want your 8th interval to be as fast or faster than your first interval. So it's important that you're maintaining that speed throughout. So that means entering into those intervals, you might want to go at sort of 70 to 80% of your max. So if you're using like an RPE scale, rate of perceived exertion, it might be that you're at sort of 7 or 8 in the first interval. And then by the last one, you're really blow it out to make sure that you're doing that interval as fast as the first one, if that makes sense. So I would say if there's no specified rest time programmed for you, just give yourself as much time as you need to really fully recover so that you can go out and make the most of that interval that you're putting out there. You can change them up as much as you want. Your program might be asking you to do 1 interval session a week. I would say that's pretty basic in terms of a program. I would usually program like an interval session and then the next week maybe a tempo and a threshold and changing it up and having a lot of variety in there. So just doing intervals is one way of doing it, but really you want to be playing around with a lot of variety and playing with different speeds and making it a bit more interesting than just an interval session each week. So you might think my answer is a little bit unsatisfactory because I don't actually know exactly what you're training for. I don't know what these intervals look like. But if in your case, you're not given any specific time between each rep, each effort, each interval for recovery, then I would just take that time, use as much time as you need between each interval to recover fully so that you're ready to really go at it for each one. You want to make sure that you're not too fatigued in each interval that you're going into, so you're making the most of each. So yeah, just use each break as a proper break to fully recover and then go out ready for the next effort. But yeah, do play with different distances, or if you're doing timed intervals, play with different amounts of time each interval could be. If you want to build that endurance of that fast pace, it might be that you're doing like a 5-minute interval, which is going to be a bit slower to maintain it. It could be that you're doing a 1-minute interval, which is going to be a real fast effort. But the time between really depends on what you're training for. I've done plenty of sessions where I'll do like a 2-minute interval and only give myself a certain amount of time between each. And that means that I'm looking at all of the intervals. If I've got 10 intervals to do, I know that I need to manage my effort so that I'm still performing as well as I possibly can at the end compared to at the start. But that would be the sort of golden rule of these interval sessions that I would try and recommend for you, is that last interval that you're doing should be as well executed as the first. I hope that helps. We can do far more on the specifics of how to program intervals into your training and what they look like and the variety that's available in interval sessions. But as a quick answer, I hope that helps. Thanks again, Adam. Okay, next question.
Hi, Tom. This is Yuri from the Netherlands. Really like the podcast and your content. With the upcoming winter, I'm finding it quite difficult to dress correctly. Either I'm too cold or too hot. I'm having a lot of trouble with that. So I was wondering, what is your advice on dressing for colder climates and maybe more changing climates? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Yuri. This is a really interesting topic and something I'm always trying to figure out myself as well. I have a couple of rules that I try and keep to, and it's really just from personal experience. Once the temperature drops to single digits Celsius, I tend to put on another top layer, like a thin top layer, because that does help. I think the one thing that's the biggest struggle is at the start of your run, just feeling really cold. And that can be different for everyone. Everyone runs differently in terms of, like, I tend to run quite hot. Some people will need to put more layers on. It really does come down to personal preference at the end of the day. But when it gets really cold, I do find having tights on the bottom and top is helpful. When it's really sort of sub-zero degrees, I think it's helpful to have a few more layers. And it also depends on what session you're doing. If you've got a higher intensity session, of course your body is going to be a lot warmer throughout. So you might not need extra layers necessarily. But if you're doing like an easy session, if you're doing an easy run, I would say layering up a bit is going to be helpful. There's a part of me that also thinks if you don't layer up very much, you're going to sort of increase the likelihood that you're going to go out fast to warm up, and then that might impact your training. So really have a think about how you're going to warm up throughout the race, throughout the run. I actually tend to stick to a rule of be bold, start cold. You're always going to start a lot colder and then warm up throughout. Personally, this is personal preference, I hate delayering. I think it's just a faff and annoying. So if I can ever sort of start cold and warm up throughout and not have to deal with sort of delayering and wrapping an extra layer around me to make sure I'm managing my temperature, then that's probably my preference. But yeah, it really depends on personal preference, this one. Some people prefer delayering. They want to start warmer and then, delayer as they go out throughout the run. So it's a difficult one for me to give advice on. But yeah, sub 10 degrees, I usually put on an extra layer. Sub 0, I would start putting on skins, start putting on tights and thermals, that sort of stuff. But it also depends on what your training session is. And how much you get annoyed by delayering. I get really annoyed by it. So I tend to think, be bold, start cold. And that's a good rule of thumb for me. It's always tough when you step out the door and it's really Baltic cold. I know it sucks, but you do warm up throughout. So that would be my advice. Be bold, start cold, avoid delayering because it's a faff and annoying. But many people might disagree with that. So that's my take. But it does come down to personal preference and experience as well. I hope that helps. I think it just comes down to whatever you want to do. It's a tough one. There's no magic answer to this one, I don't think. So you've got to figure it out for yourself, I'm afraid, Yuri. If it's really cold and I'm going for an easy run, I'm going to add some layers. I just want to be comfortable throughout, and I want to make sure that I'm maintaining a nice, easy pace comfortably. And that tends to mean that if I'm adding a few layers, it will help me to not run too fast and not want to kind of warm up. And I'm really sort of making sure I'm getting the most out of my training by being comfortable and warm and actually enjoying it, but also running at a pace that actually makes sense. So there's a couple of tips. I don't know if that's helpful, but I appreciate the question, Yuri, and good luck in the upcoming winter.
Hi, Tommy. It's Holly here from Fleetwood, UK. Really like the podcast. I've been listening to it on my runs and it's been really helpful keeping me on track and getting me through the run, really. My question for you today would be all around the idea of fueling your body. How do you fuel your body for a run? And more specifically, I'm more interested in when you fuel. There's sometimes when I go out for a run and I've eaten little to none, or I've eaten quite a lot, but I usually wait an hour. But I just was interested what your fueling method is for your runs.
Thanks, Holly. Great question. One that we could probably spend an entire episode discussing. I'm going to try and give you a bit of a quick answer and something that I guess is guided by my own experience. Firstly, I would say don't try not to overcomplicate it. There's a lot of information out there and it can be quite confusing. Generally, of course, if you're fueling before your run, you want to give it a good amount of time for your body to digest what you've eaten. It sounds like you're doing that by giving it at least an hour before you go out on a run. During your runs, I would say, there's a lot of discussion out there at the moment about high amounts of carb. So we're talking 120 grams of carbs per hour. There's some cyclists that are doing that, and it seems to be working quite well for them. High carb fueling there's a lot of evidence to say that that's good and it's recommended. If you're using gels, then 1 or 2 gels an hour, so 2 gels an hour, one every 30-40 minutes, is going to be around 40 grams of carbs, and that's pretty good. You don't want to be consuming a gel once an hour or more, because you'll probably, with the caffeine and the high amounts of carbs, you might crash if you're not frequently taking in those gels. So once you start, don't stop on that front. And it's going to be different for training and racing. You're going to want to do some race simulation in your training, of course, and that might be just gels. A lot of people do run marathons, of course, just with gels. Most people do that, and so they'd have kind of 4 or 5 gels throughout their marathon. For a marathon distance, I would say you're pretty good to only start taking in gels about an hour into your marathon, and then take one every half an hour, 40 minutes, and that's going to look like I said, 40 grams or so per hour, and that's going to be a pretty good way to go. But like I said, don't overthink it. I think what's more important is that you're fueling well outside of your running, and so making sure you've got a good balanced diet and you've got a good mix of protein, carbs, fats, and good fuel sources. Generally, I don't like to fuel too much before my runs. It doesn't bode well for me if I'm going out on a morning run. I quite often do that without too much fueling. Just a coffee and a bowl of cereal. Like this morning, I went out fueled by coffee, a bowl of cereal and a banana, and I was out for 2 hours and I felt completely fine. But you will know whether you've not fueled enough, and it is personal experience really, and you've got to figure out what works for you and experiment. But I would say don't over fuel. Don't get yourself into a position where you're feeling uncomfortable because you've had too much at once. Little and often is good, and making sure you're just fueling well after your runs. I would say a good rule of thumb is within 90 minutes of your run, you want to be getting a good meal in. That's going to do favors for you. But yeah, like I said, don't overthink it. It's not going to be the be all and end all if you don't fuel too much on your sort of day-to-day easy running. But make sure that you do have a good amount of fuel, and hydration is going to be a really key part of this as well, making sure you're well hydrated and that you can hydrate throughout your run if you need to. But it really depends. It depends on how far you're running, how much experience you have, and how much you tend to need. For me, I sort of grit my teeth through my runs, and I will only sort of fuel if I'm going out on really long runs and I need to make sure I'm maintaining a good amount of energy. So if I'm going on like a long run of 3 hours, I will take some gels, some bars, some real food with me, just to make sure I can kind of fuel little and often. And sort of high carb is probably my go-to be honest. But really it's a personal thing, and you got to figure out what works for you. Not a cop-out, it really is an individual thing. And the worst thing to do is just to have a big old meal right before your runs. If I'm running in the morning, I tend to have a good meal the evening before, and then like a small meal just before my runs, and wait a good amount of time for my stomach to settle, and then off I go. We'll do a whole episode on fueling. We'll dive deeply into it, and hopefully that'll be a little bit more valuable than a short answer at the end of a podcast. But I hope that does help a bit. Don't overcomplicate it, Holly. Make sure that you're doing what works for you and staying hydrated and not overeating too much before. Okay, let's do one more question from Lisa.
Hi, Tommy. This is Lisa from Denmark. I started running January this year, and I've been doing a few half marathons distances on races, and the longest distance I've run is 30 kilometers. And come March next year, I've signed up for my first backyard ultra. And I wanted to ask you how you think the supreme training plan would look like up until then. How long do you think I would need to do my longest runs up until then? And so forth. Thanks again. Love your podcast. Love your Instagram. Hi.
Thanks, Lisa. Appreciate the question. This one, again, I feel like the answer to all of my questions is it depends. And I'm not trying to avoid answering the questions. I just don't think there's complete truth in every answer. It really does depend on what you're trying to achieve from this backyard ultra. A backyard is something that doesn't really have a finish line, so it really depends on how far you want to go. But what I will say is something that's very related to this episode, which is high volume. So everything that we've spoken about today is going to be relevant to your training as it relates to training for a backyard, high volume is going to be probably your most important aspect of your training. So building nice and slowly, making sure you're getting as much volume as you possibly can is going to be a really crucial part of that. When it comes to a backyard ultras are very easy, slow-paced races, and there is a fair amount of rest in between each loop. So it's a case of just tapping away on these races and seeing how far you can go, both physically and mentally. So my advice for you would be to focus on volume and to make sure that you're consistently showing up and doing that volume in a way that is safe and sustainable. If you're doing 30k runs already, I would say you're in a very good position. Make sure you're not overdoing it. Make sure you're not feeling too intimidated by the backyard, because it is quite a friendly race in some ways. It allows for a lot of rest and it allows you to just tap away with easy pacing. There'll be a lot of walking and hiking. Maybe every uphill you'll hike and you'll run the Runnable. So just getting a lot of time on the feet is going to be such a crucial part of your training. So when you're doing those long runs, making sure they're really easy and you're not overdoing it, I think is going to be a really crucial part to your training here. But again, it really does depend on how far you're looking to go. It might be helpful to set a target, set a goal. Maybe your goal might be 15 hours or something like that. It could be 10 hours. Who knows? But regardless of your goal, you will still need to put in a good relative amount of volume for the race and then just see what happens on the day and take it easy. If you wanted to structure your week in a way that made a lot of sense, I would have one long run per week, one medium run per week, and then the rest being a lot of easy training. And then maybe once a week you want to throw in some quality session just to sort of stretch out the legs. You want to throw some strides in there, some tempo runs, maybe some threshold, just to keep your speed up as much as you want. But specifically for a backyard, there's not going to be much need for all that speed. So your priority will just be time on the feet and making sure you're safely accumulating a lot of volume before you get out on to that first loop of your backyard. Enjoy it. Backyards are fun. I've done one backyard inspired race quite recently, Lone Wolf, and had a lot of fun. And to be honest with you, I was quite pleasantly surprised by the amount of time you sort of get to rest and recoup. The strategy of the race is probably the most important piece. So making sure you're thinking as you go around the loop what you can do between those loops. So fueling little and often, making sure, like we just answered on Holly's question, making sure you're fueling little and often, and getting that fueling in at each loop is going to be really helpful. You'll find that you'll go around each loop with like clockwork. It will become very repetitive, of course, but there's an advantage there with the routine of it. And if you can just smile throughout, enjoy the process, and every time just promise that you'll get to that start line, and never quit in the chair. Don't quit between the laps. Try and promise yourself that if anything, you'll be forced to quit by maybe not making the cutoff for the loop. Thanks for the question, Lisa, and good luck on your backyard ultra. Okay, thanks for listening to this episode. I hope it was valuable for you. I hope that you've taken something away and that you're going to move forward prioritizing high volume in your training. My goal with all of these episodes is that you do find value in them and that you learn something at least each time. So let me know if you want any particular topics discussed. I'm all ears. Really keen to make sure we're covering off everything in detail and that you find value in each episode. If you want to support the podcast, I'm funding this all myself. We've not yet got any sponsors. I soon want to establish good partnerships. I'm having good conversations already with brands I love and I want to see succeed. But for the time being, this is all self-funded. If you wanted to support me in a financial way, you can buy me a coffee. There's a link at the bottom if you wanted to do that at all. Obviously no pressure, but I really appreciate any support that comes my way, whether it's just by rating the podcast, sharing it with your mates, submitting questions, getting involved. Really enjoying doing this, and I hope you're enjoying listening. Check out Devil's Gulch. There's a link in the show notes. I'll be racing the 100 miler, but there's a 50 miler and a half marathon. Beautiful scenery, beautiful race, great race directors, and hoping to see a few of you there. Thanks for listening. Again, always appreciate the support. Run the runnable, keep showing up for yourself, and I'll see you next time.